In 17th and 18th century England, coffeehouses became significant social hubs, influencing politics, economics, and daily life. This video explores their rise and impact, tracing their history from inception to decline. First, let's look at the basic features of coffeehouses. Coffeehouses were a type of establishment that became popular in England from the mid-17th to the 18th century. Their main feature was offering a variety of exotic drinks that were considered cutting-edge at the time. Besides coffee, they served tea and chocolate, all considered exotic in England then. Unlike taverns, they generally did not serve alcoholic beverages. While some patrons might have been dissatisfied with the lack of alcohol, this contributed to a relatively calm atmosphere in the coffeehouses. Another key feature of coffeehouses was their openness. This might be understood better by looking at the variety of their patrons. Inside a coffeehouse, one could see a diverse mix of people. Next to an aristocrat enjoying coffee, a journalist might be calmly sipping tea, and a thief might pass by them. Such diversity in patrons was rare in class-conscious English society. Customers, regardless of class, enjoyed coffee while engaging in free discussions. Thus, coffeehouses were not just places to drink coffee but open spaces where people from different classes could enjoy exotic drinks together. How did these unique spaces come into existence? And how did coffee reach England in the first place? Let's start from there to uncover the background that supported coffeehouse culture. In his 16th century work, Silva Silvarum, English philosopher Francis Bacon mentioned coffee in Turkey. They drink a concoction called coffea, made from a bean of the same name. It is dark in color, has a strong scent, though not a pleasant one, and they drink it boiled in water at places called coffeehouses. This beverage refreshes the head and heart and aids digestion. Though coffee might not have suited Bacon's taste, his description shows that coffee originally had a medicinal role. Coffee's history as medicine is ancient, dating back around 1,000 years to the Arabian Peninsula. Made from the fruit of the buntiu tree, coffee was used as a stomachic and stimulant. By the mid-13th century, the method of roasting and brewing coffee beans spread in the Islamic world, where it became a popular bitter black beverage. It reached the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, where the first coffeehouse opened in 1554. The way coffee was consumed then was similar to modern Turkish coffee, finely ground beans boiled for a long time. As Europeans began traveling to the east in the late 16th to 17th centuries, they became captivated by the exotic charm of coffee. In Venice, a hub of Eastern trade, coffee became fashionable early on. From there, it spread to France and England. In England, the first coffeehouse is said to have opened in Oxford in the mid-1650s. There, intellectuals enjoyed coffee while engaging in discussions in an exotic setting, marking the beginning of coffeehouses in England. From Oxford, coffeehouses spread to London and eventually became very popular. Interestingly, due to Islam's prohibition of alcohol, there was debate over the consumption of coffee, which also had stimulating effects. However, Islamic scholars often drank coffee to stay awake during their studies, leading to its acceptance. Similarly, when coffee spread from the Islamic world to Christian Europe, debates arose. Concerns over this unknown beverage were alleviated when Pope Clement VIII baptized coffee, allowing its consumption, which led to its widespread acceptance among the general populace. This story remains unverifiable, but it is an undeniable fact that people of that era craved coffee so much that it wouldn't be surprising if they blessed their drinks. However, sourcing coffee beans in the world at that time was not easy. This was because Arabia prohibited the export of raw beans. Thus, Arabia almost monopolized coffee initially. However, in the mid-17th century, the Dutch succeeded in exporting raw beans and started cultivating them in their colonies. Following this, France also received seedlings from the Dutch and began coffee cultivation in the early 18th century. Around the same time, Britain started coffee cultivation in its colonies, allowing the British to consistently access coffee. This is how the beverage of coffee reached Britain. People of the time were likely thrilled with the fresh beans arriving from the New World. Additionally, the reduction of tariffs in the 1820s led to lower coffee prices, making coffee even more accessible in Britain. The popularity of coffee became quite significant, reaching a level where it was on par with tea as a national drink. By the 1840s, the annual per capita consumption of coffee reached an impressive 1.75 pounds compared to tea's 1.44 pounds. This figure illustrates just how beloved coffee was in Britain at that time. Thus, coffee, originating in Arabia, captivated the British people by the mid-17th century. The very venue for enjoying such coffee became the coffeehouse, which is the focus of this discussion. Next, let's delve into the birth and interior of these coffeehouses. In Britain, amid an unprecedented coffee boom, people yearned to savor the wonderful aroma of coffee. However, enjoying coffee required an appropriate venue. This is where coffeehouses emerged. The first coffeehouse in Britain opened in Oxford in 1652. Scholars enjoyed the new beverage and engaged in discussions in an exotic atmosphere, marking the beginning of coffeehouses. Subsequently, coffeehouses spread to London and quickly gained popularity. Coffeehouses often displayed distinctive signs, sometimes featuring wooden coffee pots as motifs. The names of the establishments often evoked exotic places like Africa and Jamaica, though some were named after British locations or their proprietors, showcasing a wide range of names. Upon entering a coffeehouse, one would find a lively space with neatly arranged tables and chairs, topped with newspapers and magazines. Patrons could freely pick up and read these publications. In the center stood a large table, originally meant for travelers, which later became a venue for various discussions. Naturally, coffee was the main offering at coffeehouses. But they also served tea, chocolate, cocoa, and a popular drink called salsaparilla, made by boiling saffron with sugar. This drink became known as a substitute when coffee prices rose after the 18th century. As previously mentioned, alcohol was generally not served, but the coffeehouses remained bustling, often leading to customer disputes. With patrons ranging from aristocrats to swindlers and thieves, it was inevitable. To prevent trouble, some coffeehouses prohibited heated debates and gambling, imposing fines on violators. While some faced hardships due to the large gatherings, coffeehouses were opportunities for many. They were used for advertising new products and samples, much like modern-day free samples in busy areas. Advertisements offering rewards for finding stolen goods, searching for family members, or tracking runaway slaves were posted on walls or placed on tables. By the late 18th century, there were over 2,000 coffeehouses in London alone. However, the popularity of these coffeehouses wasn't solely due to the novelty and taste of coffee. The coffeehouse atmosphere deeply resonated with people of that time. To understand this, one must grasp the movements in Britain during that era. So next, let's explore why coffeehouses were beloved, considering the historical context. From the 16th to the 18th century, Britain underwent significant transformations. During the Tudor period from the 16th to the early 17th century, Britain embarked on extensive overseas expansion, establishing the East India Company and seeking wealth. However, with no heirs from Queen Elizabeth I of the Tudor dynasty, James I from the Stuart family in Scotland was invited in 1603, transitioning from the Tudor to the Stuart dynasty. The new monarch, James I, enforced strict religious control to strengthen his power, sparking fierce opposition from a religious faction called the Puritans. This led to the famous Puritan Revolution, followed by Oliver Cromwell's dictatorship. Yet, political stability in Britain was still elusive. In 1660, the Restoration occurred. In other words, it was the restoration of the Stuart dynasty. During this period, reactionary politics were enacted against the Puritans, characterized by the resurgence of Catholicism and the expansion of royal power. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred. Parliament, feeling threatened by the pro-Catholic stance, deposed the king and invited a new monarch to maintain the Church of England's structure. This event solidified the British constitutional monarchy, based on parliamentary system and the Church of England, establishing the principle that the king reigns but does not rule. Thus, the turbulent era of England finally came to an end, and the country began its journey into a relatively stable 18th century. How was it? Considering the people who lived during that time, It can be said that turbulent is an understatement for the period of continuous and significant societal changes. These intense domestic movements greatly increased one aspect of English society, its fluidity. In other words, awareness of class order weakened. The major turmoil in religion and political systems shook the established norms of English society. What is right and what is wrong? What will our world become? In such a chaotic society, practical ability to survive the next day took precedence over mere class titles. Gradually, people began to exchange information and cooperate, regardless of class. This increased social fluidity, breaking down class barriers and enabling cross-class interactions. The place that symbolized these societal changes was the coffeehouse. The new presence of coffee helped diminish traditional class consciousness and facilitated social interaction across class lines. The coffeehouse encouraged communication among people of different classes, forming groups based on common interests and abilities, without worrying much about class differences. However, even though class barriers weakened, it was still common for people to communicate mainly within their own class. For example, it wasn't that nobles and working-class people could talk as equals, but rather that the sense of class among nobles softened. Nevertheless, for nobles of the time, whose pride walked around in clothing, the breakdown of class consciousness among them was a significant change. Let's return to the topic of coffeehouses. Anyone could enter a coffeehouse and talk freely as long as they paid. Inside, political debates occurred alongside discussions on fashion, literary arguments raged at another table, and small transactions took place. Eventually, these spaces became chaotic hubs of diverse information exchange. Thus, the social changes in England brought about a new culture that flourished in the form of coffeehouses. Coffeehouses, responding to the era's changes, became symbols of the new age and played an indispensable role in society. In England from the mid-17th to the 18th century, coffeehouses had a significant impact on society. They played various roles beyond just being dining establishments. Firstly, they played a role in the political arena. In the aftermath of the Puritan Revolution in the late 17th century, coffeehouses became important venues for political discussion. Providing a space to discuss politics and criticize power was one of their biggest attractions. The 18th century poet Pope even said, "Coffee makes politicians wise," highlighting the coffeehouse's established role as places for political discourse. However, such venues sometimes became hotbeds of conspiracy, prompting authorities to send spies to monitor them. Secondly, their economic role cannot be overlooked. For the burgeoning bourgeoisie of the mid-17th century, coffeehouses were perfect places for exchanging business information. They obtained information from nobles who frequented the court or parliament, and exchanged information among merchants, making coffeehouses essential for economic activities. Notably, Edward Lloyd's Coffeehouse, opened around 1688, is known as the birthplace of what would become Lloyd's of London, the world's largest insurance company. Until the 17th century, insurance companies as we know them today did not exist. Financiers and traders individually underwrote insurance. However, finding underwriters for high-risk insurance, such as ship cargo, was challenging. Lloyd's Coffeehouse began publishing Lloyd's News, which included shipping information, and started handling maritime insurance. Thus, coffeehouses were a foundation supporting England's economic activities at the time. Furthermore, coffeehouses contributed to the development of journalism. As already mentioned, political and economic trends were crucial issues directly affecting citizens' lives. Coffeehouses had newspapers and magazines available for anyone to read freely, making them key places for citizens to obtain information. Journalists, who produced the newspapers and magazines read by the citizens, also collected information at coffeehouses. Functioning as places where information was exchanged, coffeehouses played a role in various fields such as politics, economics, and journalism. In an open atmosphere, people from different classes gathered and engaged in free discussions. The energy generated from there was driving British society. However, in the latter half of the 18th century, coffeehouses began to show signs of change. Contrary to the openness we have discussed, a more closed-off space started to emerge within coffeehouses. Why did this happen? And what was the ultimate fate of coffeehouse culture? Let's follow the process of transformation and decline of coffeehouses. As coffeehouses became widely accessible to the general public, changes began to occur within them. Once open and freewheeling spaces for discussion, coffeehouses gradually transformed into exclusive gatherings for people with specific social strata or purposes. For example, around the latter half of the 18th century, member-only clubs started to appear within coffeehouses. These coffee clubs were highly exclusive, characterized by gatherings of people with like-minded goals. Behind this change was a new movement in British society. Looking back at Britain up to the 18th century, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 established a constitutional monarchy. A responsible cabinet system emerged in the mid-1700s, and the era saw the establishment of a parliamentary system dominated by political parties. In other words, it was a time when attention to politics heightened, and the importance of organizations like political parties, which banded together like-minded individuals, rapidly increased. In this context, the coffeehouse clubs strengthened their roles as political associations, transforming into places where members of specific factions gathered to discuss politics. Additionally, by the latter half of the 18th century, the revolutionary spirit that had begun with Puritan opposition had settled, and society regained stability. Consequently, there was no longer a desperate need to break down class barriers for survival. The pride of the aristocracy quickly recovered, and they started to gather among themselves, further contributing to the exclusivity of the clubs. Interestingly, the clubs of that era were not solely political. There were also clubs engaging in ethically questionable extreme activities, and others focused on welfare work, creating a variety of club types. Thus, coffeehouses, once open spaces for free discussion, gradually turned into places where only people with specific purposes gathered. From spaces where everyone could freely exchange opinions, they became closed environments for those with shared views. This transformation was part of the process of coffeehouses' decline. However, this change in coffeehouses was not the only cause of their decline. The waning popularity of coffee itself also contributed to the decline of coffeehouses. From the latter half of the 18th century to the 19th century, coffee consumption in Britain began to stagnate. One reason for this was the rise of tea. The massive importation of tea from India and Ceylon led to a drop in tea prices, while coffee prices soared due to conflicts in Ceylon, a major coffee-producing region. As a result, Ceylon's coffee plantations switched to tea cultivation, and the British people shifted from expensive coffee to affordable tea. Moreover, the simple decline in coffee quality also contributed to the decrease in coffee consumption. At the time, it was legal in Britain to add various adulterants to coffee. Chicory, for instance, was used as a coffee substitute. From the 1830s, there were repeated calls for legal regulation regarding the mixing of chicory. However, in 1853, the British government ultimately allowed the sale of chicory-mixed coffee, provided the packaging clearly stated the mixture. This led to the widespread availability of poor-quality coffee. Without regulations on the amount of chicory, consumers found it almost impossible to avoid adulterated coffee. It was common for so-called quasi-coffee to contain more than 25% chicory, and roasted acorns or date seeds were also used as coffee substitutes, making the taste of coffee understandably bad. Consequently, coffee became expensive and unpalatable for the British people, making it natural for them to drift away from coffee. Thus, coffeehouses, which once fascinated people, changed their form with the times. They shifted from open spaces for interaction to closed gatherings of clubs. Coupled with the declining popularity of coffee, they lost their former vibrancy. Nonetheless, the impact left by coffeehouses was significant. In various fields such as politics, economics, and journalism, they played a pivotal role in supporting Britain through turbulent times. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful content. Take care and see you in the next video. Goodbye.